Let's dive into a world that feels a bit like a dark fantasy parable, one drawn straight from the heart of German literature. It asks a really provocative question. What if the figures we see as villains aren't villains at all? What if they're actually the most essential agents of change? Today, we're exploring the productive shadow.
And we have to start here, with this absolutely mind-bending quote from Goethe's Faust. It's spoken by the demon Mephistopheles. "I am part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good." I mean, just think about that for a second. It completely flips our ideas of morality on their head. How can a being who is literally dedicated to destruction end up creating something good? Well, that's the central mystery we're going to unravel.
And we're going to explore this whole thing in 5 acts. First, we'll get a handle on what these productive shadows really are. Then, we'll step inside the prison of perfection they're meant to destroy. After that, we'll meet our 2 agents of chaos, see the incredible freedom that's forged in the fire they create, and finally, really try to understand the profound legacy of their struggle.
All right, Act 1, Shadows that Create Worlds. This is where we deconstruct our whole idea of villainy. You see, characters like Mephistopheles or the god Wotan from Wagner's operas, they aren't just your standard bad guys. They are what you might call productive shadows. They're the necessary friction that prevents a world from just grinding to a halt in self-satisfied stagnation.
The key concept we need to get our heads around is the destructive catalyst. The best way to think about it is like a controlled demolition, right? If you want to build a brand new, better skyscraper, you can't just build it on top of the old one. You have to bring the old, outdated one down first. These characters, they're the demolition crew. They are clearing the way for progress. So destruction isn't the point. It's just the essential first step toward creating something new.
So that brings us to Act 2, the prison of perfection. Because if these characters are the solution, what's the problem? Well, in these stories, the real enemy isn't chaos or evil. It's perfect, rigid order. The kind of order that leads to decay. The true enemy is stagnation.
And here we see 2 different worlds that are basically dying from the exact same disease. On one hand, you have Faust's world. It's a prison of the mind. He's a genius who's learned everything there is to know, so he has absolutely no reason to try anymore. Then you have Wotan's world, which is a prison of order. Its divine laws are so perfect and unbending that nothing new can ever grow. Both worlds are literally suffocating in their own perfection.
And this image of Wotan's spear really hits it home. You see, the ancient laws, the runes carved into his spear, they were supposed to be the foundation of the world. But over time, they stopped being a foundation and started being the bars of a cage. They prevent growth, they prevent evolution, they prevent freedom. The system isn't just orderly. It's a prison. It's suffocating everyone.
So, the big question is, how do you break out of a cage like that? Well, that brings us to Act 3, Agents of Necessary Chaos. This is where Mephistopheles and Wotan step onto the stage, not as villains, but as the catalysts needed to shatter these stagnant worlds.
And it's fascinating to break down how they do it because they have very different approaches to the exact same problem. Mephistopheles is an external force. He's the tempter from the outside, poking and prodding Faust. Wotan, though, is an internal architect of ruin. He's the king who realizes his own kingdom has to fall. One wants to subvert the divine order, the other wants to preserve cosmic evolution by destroying his own order. But here's the crazy part, they both end up achieving a surprisingly similar outcome.
Let's look a little closer at Mephistopheles. He is the divine friction that Faust so desperately needs. Without the devil's temptations, Faust would just sit in his study and wither away into nothing. Mephistopheles doesn't just force Faust to act, he forces him to strive, to constantly struggle and fight and push forward. And in this German worldview, it's that struggle itself, that relentless effort, that actually makes a person worthy of redemption.
Now, Wotan's story, it's maybe even more profound. He's like the system administrator who realizes his own operating system is completely obsolete, and it's causing the entire world to crash. So in this incredible act of wisdom, he decides to bring the whole system down himself. He literally wills his own end. He sacrifices his divine authority because he understands that the evolution of the world is more important than his own reign. His self-destruction is a deliberate, necessary act to clear the path for whatever has to come next.
Which brings us to Act 4, Freedom Forged in Fire. So, what rises from the ashes of these old, broken-down orders? The answer is a new kind of human. A new, more dynamic form of humanity.
You can really see this evolution as a 3-step process. It starts with the stagnant order,
defined by those rigid laws on Votan's spear. Then comes the necessary systemic collapse, when Votan willingly lets his own power crumble into chaos. And then, finally, out of the ashes of all that chaos, a new freedom emerges, and it's embodied by the hero Siegfried.
And Siegfried is so much more than just a hero. He's a symbol. He represents humanity finally unshackled, finally freed from that cage of ancient, rigid laws. He isn't bound by old contracts written on a spear. He acts from instinct, from love, from a new kind of inner truth. He is the living, breathing legacy of Wotan's destructive sacrifice.
And that leads us to our final act, where we can finally tie all these threads together. What is the ultimate point of these productive shadows? What is the legacy of all this struggle?
When you look at these two stories together, they reveal something deep, a core tenet, you could say, of the German soul, that progress is never easy. It's never comfortable. It demands that we have a productive struggle with our shadows, both the external ones, like a tempter, and the internal ones, like the outdated rules we live by, the ones that Wotan represents. This struggle isn't a bug. It's the feature. It is the very engine of advancement.
And so we end by turning this whole idea on our own world. If progress truly requires destruction, then we have to ask ourselves, what rigid laws, what outdated systems, what cages of our own making must fall today for a newer, higher freedom to emerge?